Arthur, Prince of Wales, was the elder brother to the infamous King Henry VIII, a name undoubtedly familiar to everyone in history. Yet, did you know that Arthur was actually the one destined to sit on the throne and lead England into a glorious era? Instead, fate dealt one of history's most definitive twists, changing the future forever. This is the tragic story of Arthur Tudor, the king who never was. Prince Arthur's sudden and peculiar death baffled the royal physicians of his time, and it remains a mystery to this day. But modern researchers believe they may have finally uncovered the true cause of this tragic loss. Could one life cut short truly alter the fate of an entire empire? You'll be surprised by the answer. Arthur's birth in September 1486 was more than just a major 15th century event. It was a historical landmark. His parents, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York, were forging the new Tudor dynasty after the tumultuous Wars of the Roses. Imagine decades of brutal civil war, bloody battles for the throne between the houses of Lancaster and York. In this landscape, Arthur's arrival was a beacon of hope, a symbol of stability and a promise of peace after the storm. His birth solidified their fledgling power. Yet there was a peculiar aspect to the boy's very arrival. King Henry VII had seized the throne through battle, not inherited it through royal lineage, making him profoundly insecure about his own origins. This insecurity was so profound that he named his son after the legendary King Arthur, as if to magically prove his own lineage to England's great hero. He was attempting to rewrite his own historical narrative, rooting his new dynasty in ancient myths even if no proof existed. Was this political genius or sheer obsession? Perhaps a bit of both. To further cement this fictional narrative, Henry VII even compelled Queen Elizabeth to give birth to Arthur at St. Swithin's Priory, a place widely believed to be King Arthur's Camelot. Seriously, Arthur's father was obsessed with turning his own medieval historical fiction into reality. This act vividly illustrates Henry VII's desperation to create a solid foundation for his new Tudor dynasty, placing an immense burden on the young prince's shoulders from the moment he was born. Clearly, this wasn't the best parenting idea, and the king's next move was even more audacious. Despite the immense expectations placed upon him, Arthur exceeded everyone's wildest dreams. He was healthy, remarkably tall for his age, with reddish blonde hair and a straight nose. Arthur looked like a prince straight out of a fairy tale, and many considered him exceedingly handsome. As the Golden Prince of the Tudor court, Arthur knew he had to be exceptional, and he was more than that. This 15th century dream boy had an extensive classical education, was an excellent archer, a skilled scholar, and he could own the dance floor at court. However, there was an underlying issue. While many saw Prince Arthur as the epitome of a modern medieval gentleman, he wasn't perfect. Despite being physically robust, he had a rather quiet disposition. Courtiers described him as gentle and mild-mannered, seeing him as a fragile boy. For a long time, this wasn't an issue, but it would come back to haunt him later. Was this quietness a sign of a sensitive soul, or a reflection of the overwhelming burden he carried from such a young age? During this time, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York continued trying for more heirs, but the royal couple found only heartbreak. Arthur lost many of his siblings to infant illnesses, a common tragedy of the era, and only 3 of his younger siblings, Henry, Margaret and Mary, survived to adulthood. Ironically, these early deaths seemed like an ominous omen for his own tragic fate. Grief is a great bonding tool, and the royal children were all very close. Arthur was especially fond of his younger sister Margaret, who was 3 years his junior. He also shared a nursery with his little brother Henry, who was born when Arthur was 5. Arthur excelled at being an older brother, passing on all his big brother wisdom to little Henry. Pity Henry didn't take better notes. In 1497, Arthur and Catherine of Aragon took another step toward marriage in a formal engagement. It sounds romantic, but in reality, the day was incredibly strange. The engagement happened by proxy, a common practice at the time where the couple wasn't actually in the same room. Instead, a Spanish envoy stood in for Catherine. If that sounds anticlimactic for romance, just wait. 2 years later, the royal couple still hadn't met, but they were ready to level up. In 1499, they held a full wedding ceremony. Yes, also by proxy. 13-year-old Prince Arthur and Catherine knew less about each other than reality dating show contestants, yet they were officially married. Even so, Arthur's reaction was incredibly emotional. The young, romantic Arthur had clearly built Catherine into an epic figure in his mind because he was exceedingly joyful about his lonely wedding. He wrote letters to Catherine and her parents, assuring them he would be a true and loving husband. It's truly heartbreaking for the young boy. But as we all know, high expectations can lead to great disappointment. On October 2nd, 1501, Catherine of Aragon finally set foot in England. A month later, the royal couple met for the very first time. When they opened their mouths to speak, a harsh truth emerged. Though both knew Latin, they had learned different pronunciations and couldn't understand each other. Q, the sad trombone. Like it or not, the wheels of history were already in motion. To be fair, Catherine probably didn't disappoint Arthur in appearance. She had long, reddish-blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a lovely plump face. People literally called her the most beautiful creature in the world. Because this was royalty, Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon had another wedding, finally in person, on November 14th, 1501. And this time, they went all out. The couple married at the historic St. Paul's Cathedral, with the bride and groom dressed in matching white satin for the ceremony. But that wasn't all. Arthur's father, King Henry, knew how to do propaganda, and he ensured his son's wedding was the pinnacle of royal extravagance. To accompany the ceremony, there were 3 days of jousting at Westminster Palace, and St. Paul's Cathedral even provided a fountain next to the church that flowed with endless wine for the common people. But then everything went from civilized to incredibly awkward and shocking. When it was time for Arthur and Catherine to retire, the party truly came alive. As the teenage Prince Arthur and his bride prepared to leave, the evening took a disturbing turn. Arthur's paternal grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, orchestrated a public bedding ceremony for the couple. Yes, it's as disgusting as you imagine. After sprinkling holy water on the marriage bed, Margaret invited Catherine in, reverently undressed her and placed her on the bed. You can guess what happened next. After Catherine of Aragon was horrifyingly prepared, Prince Arthur, also scantily clad, entered the bedchamber with the gentlemen of his wedding party, complete with musicians playing instruments. To cap off this embarrassing event, the Bishop of London then blessed the bed for procreation. Seriously, truly disgusting. And it gets worse. You might think that in the Middle Ages they did bizarre things like this every day. But hold on to your hats, because they actually didn't. Arthur and Catherine's ceremony was the only recorded instance of a public bedding ceremony in 16th century England. So yes, it was truly peculiar. Ironically, exactly what happened that night would soon become an infamous part of history. But before that could happen, Arthur had to go through hell. For a brief moment, Arthur's royal wedding was like a fairy tale. The newly married couple honeymooned at Tickenhill Manor, a place as idyllic as its name. Afterward, Arthur moved to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches because, after all, he was the Prince of Wales. This is precisely where things started to go horribly wrong. Arthur's father, King Henry VII, noticed something alarming after his son's marriage. His heir was growing weaker, as if some unnamed illness was taking hold of him. Both Arthur and Catherine contracted a mysterious illness in the spring of 1502 and were confined to their beds. Tragically, their illness suddenly turned severe and fatal. Catherine was in a violent delirium from her sickness, and when she finally awoke, she made a shocking discovery: she had become a widow. Arthur passed away on April 2nd, 1502, just half a year before his 16th birthday. Catherine was now a teenage widow, and the prince's body was growing cold on his sickbed. When news of their eldest son's death reached Arthur's parents, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth, the grief was utterly devastating. King Henry's confessor was the one who delivered the tragic news, telling him, "Your dearest son has gone to God." Upon hearing those words, the great warrior king burst into bitter weeping. Once King Henry knew the truth, he had to break the news to his wife, Queen Elizabeth, who spent the entire night comforting her husband, assuring him they still had other children to carry on the crown's duties. Of course, this was only a brave front. The Queen left her husband's chambers, walked into her own private room, and immediately collapsed into sobs for her beloved son. Prince Arthur's funeral was a grand event filled with sorrow and lasting for days. On April 8th, almost the entirety of London took to the streets to process for his soul, and every parish church sang a dirge for their lost prince. On April 23rd, his attendants sprinkled holy water on his embalmed body and laid him to rest at Ludlow Castle. Only one major thing was missing. Despite Catherine of Aragon's immense grief, she wasn't even allowed to attend Arthur's funeral. According to royal tradition, widows were forbidden from attending funeral services, so Catherine had to endure her grief alone and bewildered, without her Prince Arthur to guide her. But in reality, she had far bigger things to worry about. Prince Arthur is largely forgotten today, but if he had survived, that responsible, loving boy very well could have become an excellent, just King of England. Instead, we got something very different. His younger brother replaced him as heir, and that was none other than the infamous King Henry VIII. And that wasn't the only way Arthur's tragic end altered the course of history. What if Arthur had lived? How might English history have unfolded differently? The moment Catherine became Arthur's widow, her position became extremely precarious. King Henry VII was anxious to keep Catherine's dowry, and sending her back to Spain would mean refunding the entire sum. Rather than do that, the king made a fateful proposal. Catherine should marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry. This famously did not end well, and ultimately it all came back to Arthur. Catherine's marriage to Henry was incredibly scandalous at the time because she had been married to his brother. They had to seek a special dispensation from the Pope for this marriage. Even then, the royal family received only reluctant approval, and only after Catherine made a highly controversial confession. The royal appeal to the Pope hinged on a single declaration: Catherine's assurance that she and Arthur had never consummated their marriage. Though it took a long time, it eventually took effect, and Arthur's former wife married his younger brother 7 years later, tying the knot on June 11th, 1509. But was Catherine's declaration true? Did they really never sleep together? While they had a very public bedding ceremony, we may never truly know what actually transpired behind Catherine and Arthur's closed doors. This remains one of history's greatest enduring mysteries. One popular perspective believes Catherine told the truth, as otherwise her later marriage to Henry VIII would have been sinful in God's eyes. Another perspective suggests they might simply have been too young for such an act. For a 15-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl, the pressure and lack of experience could have led to them not completing their royal duty. However, there's also another disturbing possibility. Because Arthur's health seemed to decline immediately after his wedding, some historians argue he was simply too weak to be effective in the bedchamber. Then once the deadly illness struck, the frail, sickly teenager was too busy trying to survive to even think about it. Either way, this entire situation would continue to haunt Catherine. Ultimately, Catherine of Aragon was King Henry's queen for over 20 years, but the ghost of Arthur still haunted her, waiting for its chance to strike. Catherine never bore Henry a male heir. By 1525, she was past childbearing age, and Henry was infatuated with his mistress, Anne Boleyn. That's when Arthur rose from the grave, seething with indignation. For Anne, and wanting to make her his fertile queen, Henry began to find every scriptural reason to cast Catherine aside. And when we say scriptural, we mean the Bible. According to Henry, his marriage to Catherine was divinely cursed, all because he had violated God's law by marrying Arthur's widow, and that led to the most disturbing accusation of all. King Henry's convenient pivot to the Bible also meant he could no longer trust his wife. He believed his lack of a male heir was part of this divine punishment, so Catherine must have lied when she claimed she and Prince Arthur never slept together. Thus, with one final twisting knife, Arthur's end cemented the future of the English monarchy. King Henry's desperation to discard Catherine through his deceased brother, Arthur, became what is famously known as the King's Great Matter. Today, everyone knows it ended in a revolution, with Henry seizing control as head of the church, nullifying his own marriage, and ushering in the English Reformation. And all because Prince Arthur had to fall. Today, historians can only speculate what brought Prince Arthur down. Contemporary sources say the prince and princess battled a malign vapor which proceeded from the air for nearly a month. However, that's not exactly helpful. Medieval people, after all, assumed all illnesses came from the air. However, some researchers believe they have the answer. While there's no way to confirm for certain, historians know that the sweating sickness, a plague that erupted in the late 15th century before mysteriously vanishing in 1551, was ravaging the Welsh border region at the time. This disease was known for its rapid spread and high mortality, causing symptoms like high fever, profuse sweating, and delirium. It is entirely possible that this was the illness that fatally struck Prince Arthur, just as it did many of his contemporaries. Though largely forgotten in the annals of history, Prince Arthur's death shaped an entire historical era. A tragic fate, a mysterious death, ignited England's greatest turning points, permanently altering the structure of power and belief. Arthur's story is a potent reminder that sometimes the forgotten destinies are the ones that truly determine the future. If you've enjoyed these stories, don't forget to show your love by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Stay tuned, as we'll be back with even more astonishing stories soon. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.